Hey, advanced procrastinators, let's do another review. Today we're looking at Chapter 11 and we're looking at the issue of populism in the United States. Okay. Um, hopefully, this today is a short one. So, hopefully, you've started with these 10 questions, and these are your five checking for understanding questions answer from this issue of populism. So, populism, what we're talking about today is the idea of actually the government getting involved and trying to make things better for the people of the country, right? And the farmers are the ones who are going to be at the center of the populist movement in the United States. Now, the farmers were being impacted by corporate greed in a lot of ways, and the railroads in particular, and they needed the federal government to get involved. And one thing that was happening to the federal government, we said before, is there was a protective tariff designed to protect industries. But the farmers were against the tariff because they wanted to sell their food overseas. And a high tariff in the US would result in a high tariff against food in Europe. So the tariff was put in place to protect American companies and force Americans to buy American products. But at the same time, now the farmers could not make money selling their goods overseas. So farmers, because they were going into debt and they were losing money, they wanted the US dollar to be backed with silver. Now, the reason why they wanted the American dollar to be backed with silver, meaning if you turn in a piece of paper, a dollar bill, you get $8 worth of silver. Now, the reason why they wanted to be silver, this would expand the money supply. Now, this would make it easier to get loans and to get cash, and it would cause inflation. Now, normally inflation would seem to be a bad thing because people have to pay more money for stuff. But for the farmers, they thought that inflation would be great because one, it would increase the price of food. So the food being sold at a higher price would make the farmers more money. And with the debt that the farmers had, right? That debt at a certain amount of money is the same amount of debt. So if they're $100,000 in debt, they owe $100,000. But if inflation went up, it would make them easier to pay back that $100,000 because now there's more money floating about and they're selling their food for even higher prices. Now, money in the late 1800s was not backed by silver, it was backed by gold. Now, the people who wanted it backed by gold were the rich, the bankers, the industrialists, because they already have money and they don't want their money to lose value. If it's backed by silver, they'll only have a certain amount of money. Let's say they have $1 million, but now with inflation, that $1 million to buy the same thing you could with $1 million, you need $3 million, but they only have $1 million. So they actually lose value. Now, this is a huge issue in the late 1800s about silver versus gold. And when you think about it, well, what is the American dollar back with today? Well, here's a story about it. What makes this kind of interesting is the American dollar today is not backed by anything. It's not backed by gold. It's backed solely by the full faith and credit of the United States. Okay. It's the belief that the US will pay back its loans and people's acceptance of the dollar as a form of transaction, right? If anybody goes to Mexico, will Americans accept a peso in a shop in America? No, because nobody wants a peso. But will people in Mexico accept a dollar? Yes, because they know that dollar actually has value. Anyone, anywhere will take a dollar bill, essentially. Now, other factors, the farmers are being hurt after the Civil War. What was the problem? Well, one, grain elevators. Farmers are trying to sell their food outside of their states. They're in Kansas or Nebraska. It's got to get to, say, New York City. So, in order to get your food in New York City before you put on a railroad, you have to put in place called a grain elevator. This is where you would store your food, right? Before it was put on a railroad and sent back east to be sold. And these grain elevators basically had monopolies and they were charging high prices. They weren't owned by the farmers, they were owned by corporations. Number two is that railroads were charging excessive prices. They were charging the farmers anything they wanted to move their food. And in fact, because farmers lived in rural, isolated areas, there was no competition for a railroad. There'd be only one railroad going in that city. And that led to long versus short haul routes. Short remote routes cost actually more money than, say, a long route from, say, New York to Chicago, because the New York to Chicago route had all kinds of different railroads that were competing with each other for your ticket. So the price was set by competition. But if there's only one railroad going to, say, Wichita, Kansas, that railroad could charge anything it wanted to from Wichita, Kansas to, say, Chicago. Bankers increased their increased their interest on credit. So farmers could never pay back their loans. Farmers needed to borrow money. So bankers were charging them extreme amounts to borrow money. Okay. Now, a couple of Supreme Court cases that were brought up in order to try to protect farmers. One is Munn versus Illinois, really important one to remember. And this basically said that a state government could set a limit on how much a railroad and grain elevator could charge. It was state governments that are going to get involved and try to protect the farmers because at that level, right, if you had a state like Kansas, well, everybody's a farmer in Kansas. So it was farmers able to elect a government that supported them. So Munn versus Illinois said, look, in Kansas, the government's going to protect the farmers. The problem with this is that the railroads went from state to state, and my answer already came up here. This is similar, and the reason why this is important is identify the most popular method of transportation today that crosses state lines, and that's the interstate highway system. And the interstate highway system was built by the federal government. And what I'm trying to say here, though, right, guys, is the idea here is the problem is a state can't regulate and set rates on goods that go from one state to another. And that's the question here. Now, who has the power to regulate if it goes from Kansas to, say, Colorado or Nebraska? And that's Illinois versus Wabash. And in Wabash, it said that only the federal government can regulate interstate trade. And this opens up the door for the federal government to actually start regulating industry. Whereas before, the government was still laissez faire, but Wabash actually says, you know what? Because there's no one else that can regulate trade between states, someone has to get involved and make sure that rates are being set fairly. Now, in an effort to try to get around the fact that the government was corrupt, because you have basically two political parties, you have the Democrats and you have the Republicans. The problem is both of them were being controlled by robber barons. So what you get is a third political party, the Populist Party. And the Populist Party are started, otherwise known as the People's Party, by farmers that want the government to not be laissez-faire and help people over to business, right? And their first platform they come out with when they get together in Omaha, Nebraska, because farmers live in Nebraska, right? It's the first time that they set a proposed rules that were written demanding government get involved and not be laissez-faire. Some of these rules included number one, the government should own all major utilities, like the railroad. If everybody needs to use the railroad, why shouldn't the government be in charge of it to make sure that it's being used as an instrument to help the people rather than taking advantage of the people? Now, can you think of today something that we would like the government to own, a service or need that the government, if they own it, could supply it to us for free or at a low price, like the railroad back then? And the answer, a couple of them, could be how about the internet? We're all working from home now, guys, right? What if Wi Fi and bandwidth was completely free? We'd be pretty efficient. How about college education? Everybody needs to go to college to find a good career. Why should it cost $200,000? Maybe government get involved in that. Also, the government has already got involved by building the highways, the interstate highway system. They're called freeways because they're a free to drive on. And that's the government that spends hundreds of millions of dollars to build a freeway, and access to that freeway is free for all people. Now, another populist idea is a graduated income tax where the rich pay more in taxes. At this time, there was no income tax. There was the tariffs that collected money. So if you made $100 million in a year, you paid no taxes on that $100 million. Well, we're going to have eventually the 16th Amendment that's going to cause income tax, and the more you make, the higher percentage of your income you pay in taxes. An 8-hour workday and collective bargaining. This allows unions to help the workers and sets a precedent that every day people should work for 8 hours. If you work more than 8 hours, you get paid overtime, and also more democracy. A problem at this time is that the Senate was elected on by state legislators, by state governments, and a lot of state governments were already bought by the robber barons. So the state governments would then elect whomever the robber baron wanted to serve in the Senate. A good example of that is in California. Leland Stanford was one of the largest railroad magnates in California, and he was elected as senator from California because Leland Stanford controlled essentially state government of California. Now, Coxey's army and what were they protesting? Okay, what happens here? In 1893, the United States goes through the worst economic depression in all of American history except for the Great Depression. We have high unemployment and bank failures. And what's going to happen, unlike the Great Depression, is the government is going to deny any help. So Coxey's army was basically a march right on Washington by the unemployed army to have the federal government provide aid. And remember, federal government's attitude at that time was laissez-faire, not our deal. Now, this panic of 1893 is going to lead to the progressive movement. Now, what is a progressive movement? If you forgot, we're going to go over it in the next lecture. But basically, creates a mood in America that the government has to do more to protect Americans from unscrupulous business that helped create the panic. And that leads to the progressive movement where government is going to get involved and actually help the people. Now, why is it the progressive movement and why is it not the populist movement? What ends up happening to the Populist Party to cause it to decline? Well, what happens with the Populist Party and why it's the progressive movement that creates this change is the first problem with the populists is they were popular and their ideas were adopted into the Republican and Democratic parties, and it transforms itself into what's going to become the Progressive Party or the Progressive Movement. Also, they had success. Their ideas were incorporated into law. So the reason why the populists ended up dying is they were successful and other people absorbed their ideas. But before they were absorbed by the Republicans and Democrats, keep this in mind, is the populists did have multiple congressmen. They had two senators, and you can see in the map in the upper right-hand corner, they had a presidential candidate, James Weaver, in 1892, before the Panic of 1893, okay, who went out there and he won 4 states. Then what's going to happen is the Panic of 1893 is going to happen, and more people are going to demand more immediate change. And with the Panic of 1893, by the next election in 1896, both Democratic and Republican parties are talking like as if they're populists. Now, what is the most important lasting legacy of the Populist Party? I think you can see what I'm trying to imply here, guys, is that the government should get involved and help people in need and no longer be laissez-faire. And can you identify 2 presidential programs that are legacies of the Populist Party as far as the view of the role of government? And guys, this is going to be the meme about what your DBQ is going to be about, I think. Okay. The Square Deal by Teddy Roosevelt, my boy Teddy, who comes up with the idea of an 8-hour workday, workers' compensation, fair pay. This is a result of the progressive movement in the United States. And my boy Freddie, FDR, and all those alphabet agencies that you see. The Social Security, minimum wage, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Work Progress Administration, right? That's the beginning of the modern day Democratic Party. And it even goes beyond that in the future with the Fair Deal, in which President Truman increases minimum wage and Social Security. And the end result of the Populist Party and the New Deal is going to be the Great Society, where President Johnson in the 1960s is going to do the New Deal on steroids and create programs where the government helps that are still around with us today, like Medicare, which is health insurance for the elderly, Medicaid, which is health insurance for the poor, HUD, which allows Americans to get home loans. I can't afford it. Or Head Start, which is free preschool, which I'm sure some of you guys might have been in yourself. Okay. So keep this in mind, guys. The reason why this is so important, this chapter, is I have a feeling that the question is going to be about analyzing government's increasing role in getting involved to help Americans in need because of the crisis we're in right now with COVID-19 and the fact that the economy has been shut down and unemployment is going to record levels right now, and the government feeling it needs to get involved. And the purpose of today's lecture was to show you the transition where government went from doing nothing to doing something. So have a great day, guys. I'll see you guys when I see you.